So Georgia has another candidate in the race for lieutenant governor, another Republican. His name is John Flanders Kennedy, JFK, but the F doesn't stand for Fitzgerald; it stands for Flanders. Like Homer Simpson. Um, so one of his pet projects, everybody in the legislature generally has some kind of pet project, is dealing with chronic absenteeism in Georgia schools. Obviously that was made worse during the COVID years, and we're coming out of COVID, and um, so it should be improving. It should be noted that Georgia actually has less of a chronic absentee problem than other states or other jurisdictions, in part because Georgia actually already has a very harsh law. A child is only allowed to be out 5 days before the parents can start getting notifications and get in trouble. That wasn't true in the old days, thank God, because I was out quite a bit. But thinking about education, about chronic absenteeism, and look straight at the education system. It's the education. We got to focus on that education system. Okay, but it should be noted that Georgia also has pretty good academic scores. I could not find out what the grade average is, because apparently that's not important anymore in schools. What's important is how the children do on the various academic tests compared to other students. And Georgia actually does pretty good on those tests. I don't remember the exact percentage, but basically a fairly large percentage of Georgia students could qualify for college, and get deep in debt, go broke, and end up in a debtor's prison. you I'm kidding. They don't have debtor's prisons anymore, do they? Well, actually, they kind of do, but we don't talk about it. That's a different subject for a different video. So anyway, the guy running for lieutenant governor, John F. Kennedy, his pet project is dealing with chronic absenteeism, even though Georgia already has a very harsh law dealing with absenteeism. Now, in Georgia, 20.7% of students are chronically absent, meaning they miss 10% or more days, school days per school year, which translates into about 18. They miss about 18 days of school. It's really not that bad, in my opinion, because I was out a lot. And you know why I was out a lot? Because I was sick. you know, um, I wasn't diagnosed with some stuff until later, but I already had, some of the health issues even when I was in school. And, the politicians and even some parents and doctors and what have you, they want to try, well, the kid just doesn't want to go to school. Oh, he's putting on, he got that thermometer under the hot water. I tell you, that's what that kid's doing. Never mind, they do that kind of test ever since COVID. You don't do the old kind of under the tongue thing. You do the just beaming at your forehead. So that don't work anymore even. Like, God dang, I don't even work anymore. can't put that thing in the hot water. So it's really not that bad, I don't think. Although teachers may disagree. Politicians obviously disagree. But my point is that some of the kids are actually sick. It may not be kids just being truant, out going to the movies, out doing this, that, or whatever. Shooting pool down at the pool hall, hustling for money at the pool hall. The kids could actually be sick. And what are you going to do with a sick kid? You're going to make him go to school sick. You're going to take the kid away from the parent because the kid has health issues. I mean, Georgia has a very harsh truancy law to the degree that the juvenile courts actually make it as bad as they could. I don't know. Probably not, since, 20% of the students are supposedly chronically absent. But kids get sick. Kids have health issues. Do you want that sick kid going to school? And maybe it isn't a physical illness. Maybe the kid does have an emotional problem. Maybe the kid doesn't like school. Okay, why doesn't the kid like school? What is causing that kid not to want to go to school? If it's not a physical health problem, it's more of an emotional problem. But Georgia has had some tragedies, with students basically having nervous breakdowns, going insane, and shooting schools up. Do you actually want to force that kid that's in that kind of nervous breakdown situation? You want to actually force that kid to go to school? Now, Georgia does have alternative schools and that kind of thing, where the people in the schools are more able to deal with children with emotional problems and what have you, and pull back when they're potentially pushing the child over the edge. But whether it's an emotional problem or whether it's a physical problem, either way, the schools need to be a lot more careful with the way they handle parents and students. They don't need to make parents and students the enemy. They need to work with the parents and the students. They need to advocate for the parents and the students. Okay, this child is absent. What are we going to do? When I was in school, one of my friends, and I didn't know it, he was dying of leukemia. He was out a lot. I was out a lot. We were out a lot. I'm still here. He's not. He did not make it to graduation. He died before graduation. You're going to take a child that's actually dying and force them to go to school? It'd be good for him. It'd help his emotional outlook. Maybe, and maybe not. Maybe the child's health and all would benefit, just from getting out of the house and all. But you're going to take a dying child and actually force them to go to school when the parents are saying no and the child is saying no. You're going to force that child to go to school when the child's actually dying? We have a cold-blooded government. Our Republicans and Democrats alike, they both like to say how much they care about this country's children while they're trying to get some law passed, some agenda passed. Increase their power. They don't care about your child. They don't care about you. They care about getting elected. They care about getting as much money out of the political process as they can get out of the system. They care about themselves. They care about their wives, maybe. They care about their children, maybe. Sometimes that's a little iffy. Maybe, maybe not. But one thing is sure, they don't really care about your children. They like to use your child as an excuse to advance their political agenda, whatever their political agenda is. We're doing it for the children. That's not just a joke line. That's not just a meme. That's the reality. That's the way these politicians think. We can always use the child as an excuse, even while we're doing things to hurt the child. The voters are idiots. They don't know that we don't care about their children. They think we do. So one thing, during the COVID years, and there was remote learning, I know, I have family and friends who are teachers, and they pretty much universally said that remote learning did not work, that children fell behind during the COVID years. They fell behind. The remote learning did not work. But rather than taking that and just throwing up your hands and say, well, we can't ever have remote learning again. I'm not so sure remote learning was a total failure. I know a lot of teachers say it was. They suggest test scores make it clear that it was. But why? Why was it a failure? What is wrong with the system? Why can't kids learn remotely? Like I said, I was out a good bit. I was sick a good bit. But you know what? If I had a teacher that actually taught out of the book, I generally would make A's and B's. If I had a teacher that refused to teach out of the book, I didn't do so well. If the teacher refused to teach out of the book, I didn't do so well. Now, I would borrow notes from other students and all that, but when I was in school, I was the one that the kids borrowed the notes from because I was a lot better at taking notes than they were. Because generally, I do get more out of the written when it's written down. When I was young, I'm old now. That's the past. That's history. But when I was young and in school, I learned more from seeing it written, whether it's from my notes or whether it's from the textbook, than listening to the teacher. Well, sitting there and listening to the teacher didn't do, my mind would go somewhere else. When I was having to listen to the teacher and the teacher didn't particularly, I really don't know why the teachers don't want you to take notes, but in some cases they actually don't. They want you to focus on them talking. Now, don't be distracted, because when I'm taking notes, I also doodle. To be honest, I used to tend to doodle while I take notes. But they need to figure out, why remote learning didn't work. And they need to try to make it work. Right now they're also trying to throw up their hands and trying to stop remote work, when people have jobs and where they're working from home with their computer, their telephone, and they're remote working. And there again, politicians, we got to stop remote work. Let's just encourage these corporations to demand their workers get back to work. Well, is there evidence that productivity actually fell? Does remote work actually lower productivity, or does it increase productivity? Whether a person is sitting in a physical office or out in the warehouse or working on a production line, whatever the job is, whatever they're doing, the productivity level tends to depend on how well they're being managed. How their supervisor is performing their job. I think the idea that you cannot be properly supervised when you have remote work, I think that's wrong. I think you can be properly supervised. But the company needs to make sure that person working from home is actually producing and performing. And that goes back to actually having a supervisor that will look over performance reports. Whether the person is there or at home, you need those performance reports. You need to know what's going on. And I think most employees will pretty much be honest on how they report their time and what have you, because you've got certain goals you got to meet in your job, whatever that job is. You got certain goals you got to meet, and the employee's got to assume, well, if you got a proper supervisor, if you're lying about the performance reports that you're giving, and then the supervisor is looking at what you're actually doing, looking over what you're actually accomplishing, they will be able to tell pretty quick if you're lying about how if you're not doing what you say you're doing, they're going to catch on. At some point, they're going to catch on. So, I think Georgia actually has too harsh of attendance laws. To the degree that they're actually enforced, I'm not sure. I don't know. But what I do know is that if there's a situation, whether a child is having a real, genuine health problem, or whether the child is simply having a nervous breakdown, the very last thing you want to do is you want to act like you're God and say, "Rise up, my young man, and go to school. It'll all be good. It'll all be wonderful." As the child goes to school and throws up all day in the toilet. Spends all day in the toilet. Because you got politicians, you got administrators, you got government that doesn't really give a flying freak about that child. Doesn't really care that child's in the toilet throwing up or diarrhea or whatever. Doesn't care. Does not care. When I was in the, I don't really remember exactly what grade, but anyway, my mom was real sick during that period, and it just happened. I sprained my ankle during that period, so I was hopping, you know. I wasn't one to complain or cry or say, take me to the doctor, you know, and my mother was sick and my dad was doing what he had to do. And it was just a sprained ankle. It wasn't like I broke anything. But so I was hopping. I was hopping to the school bus. I was hopping home. And in the cafeteria, I was hopping. And I had a teacher. And the teacher thought it was funny me hopping with that food tray. Up until somebody told her, somebody had to actually tell her, get somebody to help that kid, you know. She actually was enjoying me hopping with that food tray because she was a demonic demon that she was evil. She was an evil woman. And you got to understand, you've got evil people in the school system. You've got great people in the school system. You've got wonderful people in the school system. But you also got evil people in the school system. And they don't give a freak. And what's more, even part of the so-called good people, they're overwhelmed. They're overworked. They don't, you know, they may want to do wonderful by your children, but they're so overburdened with paperwork and what have you. You know, a different teacher, now that teacher actually was enjoying me hopping, but a different teacher might have sat there, looked at me, went back to work, and not even comprehended that I had an issue. And in fairness, I was not the kind of child that whined and cried and took on, well, somebody help me. You know, I was not that kind of person. So anyway, we got a problem with politicians. And unfortunately, some really bad politicians are going to continue to be elected if the people don't start waking up. This John F. Kennedy went on the radio and talking about the absenteeism, how that he thought that was a good issue for him, and that because that was been in one of his pet projects while he's been a state senator. Now maybe he actually does want to deal with the fact that our laws are too harsh toward chronic absenteeism. But the odds are that that's not what the studies and all that he's promoting are about. It's basically being hurtful toward children that are sick a lot. Let's don't call it chronic absenteeism. Whether it's emotional or whether it's a physical illness, let's call it a chronic sickness, a chronic illness is taking place in our school system. Don't call it chronic absenteeism. Call it there's too many children who either are physically or emotionally sick and can't go to school. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the children who are sick, either physically or emotionally, and simply can't deal with the school situation for whatever reason? How do we deal with that? Let's don't make the absentee laws even more harsh than they already are, because that's not the answer. Being cold-blooded to that child is not the answer. Being cold-blooded to the parents of that child is not the answer. So I'm not saying we don't need to figure it out. And maybe John Flanders, Kennedy wants to figure it out. But I got a feeling he just wants to be even more harsh and more cruel to the parents and the children, because he's not making that clear. He's not making it clear exactly what his agenda is. His starting point is talking about chronic absenteeism. Not so many children in school are chronically sick, but chronic absenteeism. As though there's nothing wrong with the child. You know, when you use the term chronic absenteeism, you have to automatically assume that the politician doesn't really care about your child, but simply wants to make sure that child is in a seat in that class, no matter how sick that child is, so that the state of Georgia and the local school system can get whatever money they can get from that child sitting in that desk, no matter how sick they are. Anyways, we got a problem with politics. We got more of a problem with politicians than we do with chronic absenteeism. we got a lot bigger. We need more politicians to have chronic absenteeism. You go play golf more, baby. Don't sit there and think up new laws to be hurtful. Just go play golf. Get the hell out of your office. Go to the beach. Go check in a hotel with a hooker. I'm probably doing that anyway. But don't think up new ways to be hurtful to the voters that are too stupid to know how hurtful you really are. My opinion, just my opinion. If I say anything you disagree with, I understand. Sometimes I don't make myself clear, and sometimes I'm just wrong. That's the way it works. Much thanks for watching and listening. I do appreciate it.